Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me? They can't hear me. How much help are you? Let's see. How about now? Okay. Welcome to the afternoon of the second day of our conference, Downhill Slope. One more presentation for you after this one. So what we're going to talk about today is cohort data. My name is not Pam Taggart. Pam wrote this presentation. She was going to present it for you, but the doctor didn't let her come back to work yet. So I am here. My name is Jill Arend. I'm Director of Data Collections for the Department of Education. And I know a little bit about cohort, so they volunteered me to come up here. I got a couple people in the audience that could help me answer questions, though, time being, if I need help. So just to let you know, this session isn't new information. This is a kind of a reminder of how to set cohort and what we use it for and why it's important to get it right, and a little bit of a reminder on what you can do if it's not right. But obviously the emphasis is always on getting it right the first time. So we're going to start out with, why do we call it cohort? Well, there's a definition for the word cohort. A group of people banded together and treated as a group. So cohort can be all kinds of different things. You're in a group of people who does something, you're a cohort. So for our purposes, what group are banding together are the kids, and we first band them together when they enter ninth grade for the first time in Nebraska, or they enter high school for the first time in Nebraska. So we always say enter ninth grade for the first time, but if you got a kid who comes in as a 12th grader for the first time in Nebraska, well, we put them in their cohort at that point in time. So, but it was still based upon the first time that they were in ninth grade. And once you do that, if you add 4 years to it, you find out what their cohort is. So the kids that entered ninth grade in the fall of 2018, this year, their cohort was 19, 20, 21, 22. So they're in the 2022 cohort. Pretty easy to do. A lot of you should be really familiar with. Is anybody not familiar with cohort? Okay, well, at least teaching somebody something today. So, okay, so where does the cohort data come from? Well, there is a field that we collected in NSSRS. We're now collecting similar data in Advisor. In NSSRS, it was the expected graduation year. You still may see it called that in your SIS. Your vendor may still give it that name. I don't know how they label it there. But we do collect the information into now Advisor, into a field that we basically use as the expected graduation year. I think we even label it that way when we put it in Advisor validation. And it's basically supposed to be just that identification of when the student was the first time in ninth grade. And the reason we can't just derive it is because we do have kids who didn't show up for the first time in the state in ninth grade. So we can't just look at our longitudinal system to determine that. We have to give you the opportunity to tell us that. The other thing to remember, and I know this is a phrase we started when we did cohort. Cohort started in, was it 10, 11, I think was the first school year we used for it? Or 9, 10, something like that. It was a long time ago. And we had buttons made that said set it and forget it. Because that was the whole point. When you set the cohort, you determine what year that student should be graduating, essentially, or that 4 years from their first time in ninth grade. You set that cohort, and you shouldn't be trying to change it as the years go on. It's not based on when you think the student is going to graduate. Even if you are pretty sure that that student is going to be there for until they're 21. When they start school, the first time in ninth grade, it's supposed to be 4 years from them, not when you expect them to graduate high school, because that's the federal definition, and that's what we're using here. It's not something we made up. This is something that was sent down to us from the U.S. Department of Education, and it was a big push, and every state is doing this now. So it's the 4 years after the first time they're in ninth grade. Where do we get the information on when the first time they were in ninth grade, if we can determine it? Well, we look at enrollment data There was actually a school enrollment template in NSSRS. And the reason I keep mentioning NSSRS is obviously for this year, we're just now setting the 9th graders this year, setting their cohort. When we're looking at 10th, 11th, and 12th graders, for most of them, we're looking at old data. We're looking at the old data system. So we still have to think about that. And if something needs to be changed, if you're submitting, we'll talk a little bit later about the request to make a change to cohort, we may be going back to NSSRS and that data and making the changes when it's absolutely necessary and approved. So we do still talk about NSSRS and reality, and we're going to talk a little bit. We can go up to a 7-year cohort, which means we've got quite a number of years left to look at NSSRS. So there is also enrollment data, then of course an advisor. You might hear it called the Student School Association, depending on how your vendor has that data in there. So we pull the information from that, try to figure out, okay, when is this the first time the student was in 9th grade? If you try to tell us that, okay, yeah, the student just moved in my district, oh, we put them in 9th grade, their cohort is 4 years from now, but we go back and look in longitudinal system and see they were in 9th grade last year, we're going to tell you, nope, that's the wrong cohort. And we actually have a tool, a place you can look up on the website. What is the student's expected graduation year? So it's important to look at that. If you're getting a student you're not sure that is the first time in 9th grade, you think possibly they've already had their cohort set, go look it up in our system. If you can't find it, email the help desk, they'll help you out with that. Okay, a little bit more on how Indy knows. Again, we're gonna look at the demographics and enrollment data, look for that expected graduation year, first time 9th grader. We don't need expected graduation year for any kids who are not 9 through 12. If you submit it, that's fine. We're going to ignore it. But we do need it for the 9th through 12th graders. And you can't change it once you set it unless there's an error. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. Okay. So is cohort the same as class of? No. Again, you got these kids who don't graduate or maybe don't advance with their class as they're in high school. So if you have a kid who comes into 9th grade and then they go on the next year to 10th grade, but then they don't get enough credits and you say, nope, you're a 10th grader again next year. Well, then they're still in their same cohort. We're not going to move them back a cohort year. They have to stay with their cohort even though they're not staying with their class. Now, obviously, we're not concerned about the kids who are held back. Well, we're concerned about them, don't get me wrong. When it comes to cohort, we're not concerned about the kids who are held back prior to high school. If you hold them back in 2nd grade, and then they move along with that next 2nd grade class on up, again, it's not until they hit 9th grade that we're worried about the cohort. Class of is then the graduation class they're actually going to end up graduating with. So if you hold them back, or basically they don't advance in 10th grade, or maybe they're in 12th grade for a couple of years. Suddenly they advance one more year when they're the class of, but they stay in their cohort. Because when we do all the reporting, again, it's that cohort graduation rate, and we're based upon whether or not they graduated with their cohort for the 4-year. ACT, hopefully it's been pretty much finished up unless you were one of the states that were affected, I think, by the flooding. I don't remember the exact makeup date, but again, kids who take the ACT test do not take it based upon 11th grade. I love seeing the things coming out. 11th graders, only 11th graders need to come to school. I live in Lincoln. Only 11th graders need to come to school. And I know, for most kids, yeah, that's true, but I'm sitting there thinking, I know that's not true. Some 9th graders, some 10th graders need to come to school, some 12th graders need to come to school, whatever. It's those kids with their cohort year. And I know we get some kids that don't get tested, I'm sure, because they don't come to school that day because they're not an 11th grader. But guess what? They were supposed to be tested. And they don't get tested, and then it gets a ding against the district, unfortunately. But it's always cohort -1 when we're testing. So this year, this fall, or this spring, when we were testing ACT, we tested the 2020 cohort. 2019, next year their class is supposed to graduate next year, so that's when we were testing them this year. Next year's we'll test the 2021 cohort in the spring of 2020. So, and every year we go through, because I look at the ACT data when it comes in, we go through and we find kids that weren't tested and they should have been, because and a lot of times it's those kids that are still in 10th grade in the system. And occasionally the kids move up to 12th grade, but mostly it's those kids who are still listed as being in 10th grade that don't get tested. And also this is the time when we start telling you districts, hey, you didn't test this kid that's in the cohort, and then you go, oh, they're not supposed to be in the cohort. And that's when we start taking a look at it and we decide, or you decide, well, this kid's cohort needs to be changed. So what do you do then? CDC, Graduation Cohort Resolution Request Tool. Put the data in, we look at it, we still get to determine whether or not we're going to approve of the change. So, once a kid is in the cohort, how do you remove them from the cohort at your district? There's only two ways. Hopefully, if you remove them from the cohort, it's in the first way. Basically, they have to be transferred out, and transferred out requires the proper documentation. Whatever documentation you would normally need to put in your cumulative file for enrollments, that needs to be in there in order to get them out of. And you realize that you could be in on a data check somewhere. Even special education, when they're coming to review your data, they may be looking at it because they're interested in special education graduation rates. Make sure you got the documentation necessary if you're actually going to transfer them out. That should be true no matter what, but it's particularly true for your high school kids because of the cohort graduation rate. And then unfortunately, if a child dies, they can be exited from the cohort. Exciting calculations. We just had a whole session about math at lunch. I am not a statistics person, so this is a much easier calculation to do. It's just all the kids who did graduate in their cohort year, and it has to be with a regular diploma. We've got a few different types of certificate completion codes available in the enrollment system, and Advisor, and SSRS, but the only one that counts when it comes to cohort is regular high school diploma. If they earn at least a regular high school diploma, it could be a more advanced degree, like I think it's the International Baccalaureate, might be more advanced. No. But it has to be a regular high school diploma. It cannot be the certificate of completion for the IEP kids. And then we take that cohort. We get all the kids that are in the cohort and we keep them in their bucket. So we always say they're in their bucket. They stay in that bucket the entire time. They may move districts, but as long as they're in the state, they're in that bucket somewhere. And that is your denominator. Okay, what is a regular high school diploma? And this is kind of a federal definition here. I'm not going to read the entire thing through, but the underlying part is what it isn't. And that again, if it's a certificate of completion based upon an IEP goals, that's not a regular high school diploma. It has to be based upon basically the state standards, essentially is the way of thinking of it. Now, if you give your student a certificate of completion this year, because they are a special education student, but then for some reason they're going to stick around in order to do, it's like life skills or whatever, they can stay in your school, and potentially, if they eventually meet the standards for a diploma, they could get in a future year's graduation rate for that same cohort. But they do not get to be in the 4-year graduation rate for that cohort. So the federal definition tells us what we can include in that numerator. We don't have a choice about it. we have to follow the federal guidelines when it comes to determining the cohort graduation rate. Where do we use the cohort graduation rate? Who knows what the NEP is? Who doesn't know what the NEP is? Okay, that's Nebraska Education Profile. That is the replacement for the State of the Schools report. If you actually go to, I think it's nep.education.ne.gov, you'll see it. Search for Nebraska Education Profile. You'll find the link for it. That's our old, what we used to have a State of the Schools report. It's a new website now. And graduation rates are posted on there every year. AQuest, which is the state accountability system, uses graduation rates as part of its determinations. We have to report them to the federal reporting. If you were in the morning session about federal reporting, we talked about EdFacts, and it's the fact that EdFacts is how we submit all our data up to the federal government. Part of the data we do there is completers and graduates. And then we get a lot of data requests out there. Again, you were at lunch today, and if you were at lunch today, some of the data we sent for them, for that information, I'm sure included those that were graduates, whether or not they graduated. So all this data is used. We get requests way too often. Well, no. Okay. The other thing to remember is that there's not just one cohort graduation rate per cohort year. There are 4 of them, and they are based upon whether or not the student graduates in 4 years. So for this year, we're going to be calculating 4 different cohort graduation rates. The first one is the 2019 four-year cohort graduation rate. It's the official graduation rate for the state. This year we'll also be able to calculate the 2018 fifth-year cohort graduation rate. So you got those kids who should have graduated last year based upon their cohort, but graduated this year. So we'll recalculate for that. And then we go back another year. So 2017 we'll do the 6-year, and 2016 we'll do the 7-year. So we'll look at the 2016 cohort, and we'll look at the kids this year and see whether or not we've got more kids who have graduated. And that data, it says here that the 5, 6, and 7s are used for AQuest. I know that the 7th year is also used in some special education performance reports. So the data is used. However, once we calculate the 4-year rate, the official 4-year rate won't change. So making sure you get the cohorts right by the end of that student's fourth year. And if the student should not be in that cohort, making sure you get that changed before we make that calculation, or apply to get it changed. Before we make that calculation is important, because we're not going to turn around and recalculate it once we've published it on the Nebraska Education Profile. You can look up cohorts in the advisor validation website, and the graduation cohort lookup by student ID. That tells you what graduation cohort the student should be in. And there's a graduation cohort report that's just been published. The only thing I'll tell you is if you think anything looks funny in either of those, let us know. Because we've had to rewrite them for advisor, and we've had to try to pull data from 2 different systems. But we've been working hard, or at least Janice has been working hard on trying to get that done. And once you pull up the report, this is what you're going to see. And if you are familiar with the NSSRS validation website and the graduation cohort analysis tool, or GCAT tool, you'll have seen a screen that looked a lot like this there. And this is similar, except we're just putting it in a report instead of a separate tool on the website. Basically, it tells you the number of students that are in the graduation cohort. And I assume there's a column for the number of graduates. So once you start reporting graduates to us, there'll be a column of graduates that will also show up. But this will help you click in to see which students are in there. And if you go in now and take a look at that all students, you can take a look and say, hey, are there any students in my cohort that I don't think should be in there? Or are there any missing students? You start looking at that now, So you're not trying to do it on June 30th or even October 31st when we finally cut off changes to cohort data. Remember, we do have the follow-up collection that's going to occur. We'll have an additional opportunity for you to make changes to enrollment information through October 31st. It's not a separate upload this time. It'll just be going back to the previous year's student information system and making the changes. But obviously, you know, and once you start putting graduates in there, again, go back and look and make sure all of them are showing up on this report. And you can also see there's a breakdown of different race, ethnicity groups, different demographics. This particular one didn't have a lot of breakdown, but you don't know who it was, so. Okay, where can you get more resources on Cohort if you're not familiar with it or if you're trying to remind yourself what to do? These are all listed. If you open up SCED, you can download this presentation. These are all listed there. Basically, there's just a bunch of documents that we have out on our website, the student-related information, guidance for graduation cohort. There's a checklist of things you should be looking at. Non-regulatory guidance from the U.S. Department of Ed, and also ESSA's non-regulatory guidance. But of course, there have to be more guidance for us to look at. And then also the guidance for reporting dropouts to know whether or not you report a student as a dropout. Again, if you report a student as a dropout, they stay in the cohort and it does count against you when it comes to the cohort graduation rate. Because they're going to be in the denominator, they won't be in the numerator. Even if they drop out in 9th grade. They're in your cohort and they drop out in 9th grade, they stay there. It's one of the reasons we like for you to go look to see if those kids have later enrolled. Do we still have an error for that? We find them later enrolling? Yeah. So there should be basically like a warning out there to say, hey, you reported this kid as a dropout, but now we see they've been enrolled somewhere else in the state. When you find that, that's good for you because you can go back and transfer that student out and get them out of your cohort. Yes?
Where do you see that?
It's one of the errors that's in the advisor validation, or if it's in previous years, it would have been an SSRS validation. I don't know the error number.
I think Max had it, so I'm not sure which year.
Yeah. So I'm not sure of the exact error number. We'd have to look it up. But basically just trying to let you know, hey, this kid really is enrolled somewhere, and you can get them out of your cohort now. You don't have to have even if it's, say we were to calculate the 4-year and we're in the 5th year and suddenly they've enrolled in, say, Job Corps. Well, now Job Corps allows you to transfer them out. It's not going to affect your four-year cohort graduation year rate, but by transferring them out now, you can affect your 5th year cohort graduation rate and improve it by reducing the denominator there. So a lot of times that's what we end up seeing is these kids get enrolled in places like the Job Corps, and that's where you end up being able to transfer them out from those kinds of incidents. Okay, so making changes, obviously timing is critical. For the 4-year cohort graduation rate, it needs to be done by October 31st following the end of the school year, where the student should have graduated at the end of 4 years, or the cohort year. So for the 2019 cohort, by October 31st, 2019, all that needs to be finished up. Because we're going to turn around and start making our calculations then. Because at that point, we have to have that data out on the Nebraska Education Profile no later than December 31st by ESSA. They require us to do that. So we don't have a lot of flexibility after that October 31st date to allow you to continue making changes. So trying to get it done as soon as possible. If you do need to make changes, or you feel like you need to make changes, it is the graduation cohort resolution request in the Consolidated Data Collection, or the CDC. But do remember that if another district is the one that enrolled the student where the cohort was set, they're the ones that have to make the request. So if you get a student transferring in and you say that student should not have been in that cohort, you've got to convince the other district to put in the request, because we can't take the request from you. Unfortunately, they're the ones that said it. They had their reasons. So you're going to have some communication with the other district. And we don't always approve them. I'm sure a lot of people have had that happen to them. You'll try and we'll say, nope, that's the way it was, that's the way it's going to be. There's nothing we do that we don't feel like there's enough evidence to show that we can get that student out of the cohort.
Now, can the students still, I mean, is it still the last Friday in September, they can come back and you can then change them from a dropout to transfer out or whatever, if they show back up in your district?
Yeah, well, you can show that if they've dropped out and they're back by last Friday in September, you can get rid of the dropout. But even if they show up after the last Friday in September, we may have already calculated dropout. You may not be able to get away from that. But if they dropped out in their 11th grade year and now they come back in their 12th grade year and enroll, even after last Friday in September, you can still enroll them. And if they graduate, they still don't count against you. They stay in your dropout rate for the previous year.
That's what I said, you still get the dropout.
Yeah, but then if you can keep them in and get them to graduate, they can still count for you when it comes to cohort graduation rate. What?
They could drop out again.
They could drop out again, yes, and count against you, unfortunately, but because they can't count against you twice. So,
And here's another question, I'm sorry. If you have someone that transfers in from out of state, I just want to get that
Mhm.
for sure. It doesn't matter when they started school in that state, or when they started ninth grade in that state, it's whenever they came here, or if we have a transcript that says that, okay, it shows that they're 10th grade, but really they should be 11th because they looked at their transcript from Florida, and it is, they should be in this other cohort. What are we supposed to use for sure?
well, we always say it's the first time in Nebraska school, and it's basically you should be looking at and saying, okay, this student is a 10th grader, is an 11th grader, put them in there, and then base their cohort on how much longer it will be for them to graduate. That is the answer we give, right, Kalpana? Fortunately, Kalpana, who used to do our cohort stuff, was offered to come here, even though she's now at Millard, to answer questions that I didn't know the answer to. So yeah, basically, if they show up as a 12th grader, and you say, look at their transcript and say, yep, you should be able to graduate this year. You put them in as a 12th grader, then you give them just that one more year cohort. But if their transcript, you look at that and say, no, they're not, you have this much more before you can graduate, and it's going to take you 2 years. You can put them in 11th grade and set their cohort 1 year forward. But, you're never really going to be saved by those kids who are moving in like that. Yes, in the back of the room.
What about exchange students?
Exchange students, if they graduate, they can count for you. If they don't graduate, but they finish out the school year, but like they're going back home because they still need to finish up there or whatever, you can also transfer them out. In this case, it's only if the exchange student really comes and then literally drops out, like stops coming to school, do you really end up counting as a dropout. Rarely would an exchange student ever actually count against you. They can mostly only count for you. Do you ever have exchange students come and then literally just kind of drop out of school from the district? They pretty much finish the school year. So if they finish the school year but you're not graduating them because maybe they haven't met your requirements for graduation, but they're going back home, then you can transfer them out. But if they graduate with you, you can keep them as a graduate. So like I said, for the most part, they only help you with your graduation rate. They usually don't hurt it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and the reason I ask that question is a lot of times, I don't know how other districts handle something, a lot of times is exchange students will come in as maybe they're a sophomore level, but you go throw them in there and then all of a sudden you're including them on all your state testing.
Yeah.
And that's a pain, so we just throw them in that senior class, which is a lot easier container to put them into.
Yeah, and if like I said, if they haven't met the requirements to graduate, they're going back home finishing school, you can transfer them out. Those are kids pretty easy to track as far as what they're doing, as opposed to, immigrants or kids moving in and out of the country on their own, with their families, so. There was another question?
That was my question.
Oh, okay. Let me see here.
So he said he puts him as a senior?
That's what he does, yeah. But essentially, basically, If you're putting them as an 11th grader and saying that we expect them, if they were to stay here to graduate next year, you're going to be testing them on ACT.
Right. Well, I talked to some other schools and they said they did theirs as sophomores, so we've been doing that.
Yeah, either way, you're avoiding either way, you're avoiding the ACT, right?
Yeah, that's the main.
Yeah. Yes.
What if they're homeschooled and they only come to your school like for band or chorus or a fine arts class, maybe 1 or 2 periods a day?
I think we usually told them to transfer them out. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, typically because they're expected to graduate from their home school, you would transfer them out at the end of the year.
And they won't count the cohort anyway if they're less than 50%, right?
No, they count in cohort no matter what their percent is. That is not changed. We do not look at the percentage of FTE for cohort purposes. Yep.
So like, what kind of a cohort do you get?
You would still, it's kind of up to you, are they, if they're, a lot of people do it by their age. Now remember, ACT doesn't matter because they're gonna be less than 50%, they're not taking assessment. But a lot of times you just kind of base it on their age, or you're at, if mom says, well, we have them taking sophomore level classes, you might put them as a sophomore. But again, if essentially they're expected to graduate from their homeschool, if they're going to go take the GED as part of their homeschooling, because obviously in Nebraska there's no diplomas for homeschoolers, then you can transfer them out because they're going back to their regular education at the end of the year.
Do you have to give them a cohort year?
You still have to, yes. No matter what, they still have to be given, because we're going to assign them a cohort year even if you don't put it in there. I mean, we're basically going to throw you an error and say, hey, you didn't give us a expected graduation year on this kid. Now, you should be lucky in Kansas, they keep them in the cohort. Yeah, homeschool kids count against. So they don't allow you to transfer them out like Nebraska does. So at least that's the way it was back when I was talking to the people about how they were doing cohort in Kansas. So we do it a little bit differently here.
How many districts put a kid in a cohort, so they're 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, 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 and don't change their grade based on credit?
I've never really sat down and looked at that.
Is that a better way to do it?
I think we see it a lot. We see the kid go to 12th grade in the 4th year, and then 12th grade. But a lot of times those kids are actually our special education students. It's not based on credit. It's, those kids a lot of times, because you'll let them walk with their cohort, basically, with their class, but then they stay on for further education. Again, don't give them a diploma, a regular diploma. If you record them as a 210 in our system and then try to enroll them in SPED next year, we're going to throw you an error, as that is not allowed. So, because then special education will tell you, nope, that student no longer qualifies for services if they have gotten a regular diploma. They can get the certificates, but they can't get a regular diploma. Other questions about cohort? Yes? Was someone saying something? Yes?
And once they age out, that's 211 usually,
Is that the right code for age out? I don't remember. 208 for age out? 211 is GED, they said, so. 208. And again, if they age out, they stay in the denominator, they never get in the numerator. And I recognize there's not necessarily fair, but we don't set the guidance on how to do cohort. That comes down from the federal level, and we have to follow it, or we could get in trouble. So, and I think it's one of the reasons that special education does look at both the 4-year and the 7-year cohort, because obviously, if a kid graduates in the 5th year, well, they're still a graduate in the 6th year and the 7th year. So we give you, for special education, they give you that 7 years in the performance report to try to figure out which one has a better graduation rate when they're determining that.
So, yeah, I'm just trying to figure out back a year ago or whatever, if we had a student that aged out, they said
Completed with an alternate diploma is fine also, but again, they won't be in the numerator for cohort graduation rate.
It won't matter.
It will only be in the denominator, whether they're a 208 or a
211.
211, they don't count for you for graduation.
Okay. And then
Did we count 211s for 1 year, Galvana?
We count them in computers, yes.
In completers, yes. And we do also report completers to the feds. But it's different than graduates. Completers, we tell them, okay, how many got this other diploma? But cohort graduation rate only includes a regular diploma. So it does make a difference there, but it does not make a difference when it comes to the cohort graduation rate. Any other questions?
I got another one.
Yes?
After looking at this, has there ever been a 203 code?
There used to be, yes.
What was that?
That was a graduation one. 203, we used to be a graduate. And then we added additional codes, so we deprecated 203, and I don't remember the year we did it. But if you are look,
Because I just saw a bunch of 203s and I'm going, what's going on there?
Yeah. we deprecated 203, and we for future years, and was it 16, 17? Was the first year or the last year we used 203?
16, 17 doesn't show.
Okay, so 15, 16, we still use 203. So yeah, that was,
That makes sense, because they graduated in 16, yeah.
yeah. So yeah, we did have the 203 before.
Okay.
But then we expanded it to have additional codes, and that's when we got rid of 203 and said 210. 210, 211, 212 are all completers. But 210 is the only one that counts in cohort. Obviously, we all want you to all have 100% cohort graduation rate. But we also know that it's not always possible, particularly for larger districts. It's hard to avoid having at least one dropout. So, any other questions? Okay, well, thank you for putting up with me having to read your slides to you. Thanks for coming in. If you have more questions, let us know. You can also send emails to advisorhelp@nebraskacloud.org. And if you have more questions after you leave here, thanks a lot. Enjoy your last session.